everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the Path 11 podcast. I am your host, April Hanna, and I'm really excited about our show today. We're going to be speaking to Dr. Scott Kolbaba, and he has gotten together with a bunch of other physicians, 26 other physicians exactly, that created this book of miraculous experiences that doctors are sometimes hesitant to share with their patients or anyone. And we're going to be discussing the book, Physicians' Untold Stories. And Dr. Kolbaba is a practicing physician in Wheaton, Illinois. He completed his residency at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and he is proud of his family of 7 children and his puppy, Grace. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Scott.
Thanks, April. Great to be here.
Yes, and you also have, and we will put it in the show notes, but a pretty extensive just history of where you also did your residency at the Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago, and your membership awards, and we will have all of that in the show notes if people are more interested. But I'm more excited to just get to the meat and potatoes of this interview. So without further ado, I would love for you to just give our audience a little bit of a background in the field of medicine that you have been working in, and then how you kind of got inspired to create this book.
Well, April, I'm an ordinary doc, but like the television shows, I see exotic and wonderful things every day, like sore throats and diarrhea and coughs and colds. And I love medicine. I've been an ordinary, regular internal medicine doc for 35 years. I know it's hard for me to believe that it's been that long. And, I love medicine. I love the privilege I have of being able to help people, at least to some extent, most of the time. And about, maybe 10 years ago, I had an experience that got me thinking about things that are a little bit beyond this world. And I came from a real small family. My parents had only one child, me. Naturally, I was spoiled to death. I was also the only grandchild. And when my mother died, it was a real big loss for me. As a doctor, I'm used to having people live and die and seeing, the nature of life, but this really brought things very close to home. And I thought about that for a long time. And when someone leaves like that, I used to go to the phone, and when one of our kids had a neat experience, like they got a straight A's on the report card or something, I'd reach for the phone and automatically try to dial my mother, and then I'd realize that she wasn't there. And I began to wonder, if a person that has left us still is part of our lives and still can communicate with us. Well, we had a vacation. I like to take vacations with our kids. We've got, as I mentioned, 7 kids. And we take the kids and the grandkids and the spouses on vacation with us, and naturally Dad pays, and that's why everyone comes. And one of our favorite places is Cape Cod, and we go to Cape Cod about every 2 or 3 years, and we just love it there. We love the seafood, we love the beaches, and everyone has a great time. And this one particular day was an unusually wonderful day. We had a great day on the beach, and then toward the evening, the boys tend to cook on vacations. The boys were cooking, and we were having things that we don't normally have, like swordfish on the grill and baked potatoes and lots of wonderful seafood. And we went to the store to get some dessert, and there were a whole stack of cherry pies there. And we decided to get 5 pies for the dessert because we had that many people. And we got to talking, and all the boys got to talking about their favorite pies. And it turns out that everyone loved my mother's rhubarb pie. And we had a big rhubarb plant at in the back of our yard. Toward the end of the season, my mother would take all the rhubarb stalks and make rhubarb pie. It was unusually sweet. And when we'd visit her, all the kids and I would sneak, I'm sure my mother knew exactly what we were doing. We'd sneak into the kitchen with spoons and have at it right out of the pan, the heck with sanitation. And we just loved that. And the rhubarb pie was absolutely excellent. And on this vacation, we all talked about it. It was too bad that, Mom couldn't be here and make us rhubarb pie. So we got through the meal. It was just that it was an unusually perfect evening. Everyone was happy. It was just one of those kinds of nights. The sun was setting, and you had to pinch yourself just to make sure that it was just real. It was unbelievable. And I kept thinking, I wish my mother could be here to be part of this. And so my wife served the cherry pie, and I took a bite of it, and all of a sudden I got goosebumps all over because the the pie wasn't cherry, it was rhubarb. I looked at the box, it said cherry pie, but indeed this was a rhubarb pie. So you can explain it by saying, somewhere in the factory or the bakery or something, a rhubarb pie got mixed up with a cherry pie. But I think that was my sign that my mother really was aware of what was going on and was part of our lives still. And that's what got me thinking about, spiritual things. And that was the first event, I think, in my life where I really thought, there's something to this, and maybe I need to pay more attention.
Wow, that's a great story. Yeah, something, and I think that it's moments like that and signs like that, I guess you could try to explain it away of where the mishap could be, but it just feels like such a synchronicity in life.
Yes.
Those are hard stories to ignore. Yeah. Yeah. So in this book, you got 27 or 26 physicians together to kind of talk about some pretty, I would say, miraculous experiences just like that. Yes. And to get them to actually speak about it, which I think, that's one of the draws that I had and the interest in this book was to actually speak to a doctor of Western medicine and to have a talk about spirituality.
It really is unusual. Docs don't talk about this at all. In my career, I've never heard doctors talk about this unless they were prompted. And what I did when I started to think about writing a book was hang out in the doctor's lounge. And any doctor that would come in, I would say, I'm writing a book. Can you give me a story that you happen to have that you can't explain scientifically? And I interviewed probably about 200 docs, and it was amazing the number of stories that they had. And I questioned, why these are ordinary practicing docs. They have no reason to want to explain some of these really unusual things. And they actually took a risk, because when you have a regular practice, to admit that you had a vision, you had an unusual dream, that you had a premonition that saved someone's life, is going out on a limb. And these doctors, I think, risk some of their reputations to bring these stories to light. And I questioned why they did that. And I thought for a long time about this. And I used the term sappy do-gooders in the book. And I labeled many of these doctors truly sappy do-gooders. They want to do good in the world every day. They want to help someone. And I think their motivation was that they recognized that these stories would give comfort and hope to people. And that was a motivation that superseded their risk of being chastised and ostracized for telling these amazing and miraculous stories. So I heard some phenomenal stories, and it started out with one of my orthopedic surgeons who ran up to me on the floor in the hospital and grabbed me and said, "Scott, I've got to tell you, I've been dying to tell you about this mutual patient that we have and the story that happened to her." And I said, "Well, go ahead and tell me." And he said, "I can't tell it here because someone might hear me." And I said, "Dave, who did you tell this story to before?" And he said, "No one, just my wife, and that's it. I'm afraid to tell it to anyone else." So he said, "Let's go into an empty patient room and I'll tell you the story." And it was a story about a cardiac arrest in the OR. He was operating on one of my patients, and she arrested. Absent heartbeat, no pulse, no respirations, eyes closed, totally dead. And he said there was when they call a code in the OR, everyone rushes in from the ORs around. And one of the techs that had unusually red hair underneath his operating room cap came in and started to do CPR, and he wasn't doing it adequately enough. So Dr. Mokel realized that when she wasn't getting there was no pulse, and he said, "Please step aside, please step aside." He didn't, and so he finally gave him a push and pushed him aside, and he stumbled away. He started to do CPR, and after a little bit of CPR, some adrenaline, a few other drugs, she came back, and it turns out that she arrested because of the antibiotic that they'd given her. She had an anaphylactic reaction to it. Well, she survived. She came to the next day, and everything was fine. The cardiologist dismissed her, and on leaving the hospital 2 or 3 days later, Dr. Mokel sat down with her and said, "Here are the instructions for your ankle," and so forth, which is what he was going to operate on. And she said, "Thank you for saving my life." Dr. Mokel is a pretty humble kind of a guy, and he said that was just a team effort, and we all pitched in. And she said, no, I saw you push that guy with the red hair aside, and I saw you do my CPR, and that's when I started to come back. And I saw you look at the door for Dr. Kolbaba that you paged multiple times, and he didn't come because he wasn't in the hospital. And she mentioned a dozen things that were the minutia of the arrest that no one could have known except someone that had been there. And by this time, Dr. Mokel had weak knees and had to sit down. And he said, tell me what happened. And she said, when I arrested, I rose to the top of the room. I could observe everything that was happening. And I saw you push the guy away, and I saw all this stuff. And she said, my grandmother, who had died 20 years ago, also came to me and told me it wasn't my time to come, but that if I was a nice and kind person, that I would have a special place in heaven when it was my time. And then she came back, and Dr. Mokel had trouble believing this whole thing. And like I said, he didn't tell anyone this story for the longest time. And it's interesting that Mary, who was kind of not a real nice person beforehand, was the kindest and most sweet individual after this arrest. And she didn't live very long because she had lots of medical problems. She lived probably 3 or 4 years. And I'm sure at this point, she's in that special place where her grandmother talked to her about it. And after hearing that story from Dr. Mokel, I thought I better start writing some of these down. And it's interesting that there were a number of doctors that just spontaneously came to me over the next few weeks with amazing stories that I've never heard before. And I think that was a way of someone upstairs telling me that I better start writing these down and come up with a book.
Yeah. Wow. And I have to say, I give so much credit to those doctors that really faced that fear, took that risk, and gave you permission to publish their stories and were willing to be a part of this. I mean, there's a part of that just makes me so sad.
It is. It's sad that doctors don't feel that they can come up with these stories and just be open with them. And that's what one of my hopes is, that this book will allow doctors and patients to be able to talk to each other and give them permission to share these kinds of miraculous stories and even some simple stories, some coincidences that may have happened to them. And I'm hoping that doctors and individuals that are patients will think about their coincidences a little bit differently from now on also.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that this book is going to do that exactly. But do you feel that the doctors have that pressure just because, medicine is supposed to be science? And do they feel that pressure to really keep metaphysical and medicine and science very separate?
Absolutely. That's been the tradition for doctors, especially doctors in our area that are very conservative, and I think they try to keep things very separate. It's interesting, however, now after this book has been published, these doctors have gotten some notoriety, and no one has been criticized. As a matter of fact, doctors have been praised for coming through with these stories. And it's very interesting. We had one doctor that wanted to remain anonymous. Every other doctor wanted to have their name in the book. But the one doctor that is anonymous at our launch, and he was seeing how these doctors were really being praised for their openness, said, I don't want to be anonymous anymore. I want you to get my name out there because I want to be part of this movement too. And so it's kind of cool that, maybe this is making some difference, and the doctors will be more open, and patients may be more open too with their doctors about spiritual matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also proves that sometimes, when we work through our fears, sometimes what we fear may be the reality, the opposite actually happens,
And that's what happened here. Yeah.
Yeah. And so as I was reading through this book, every story like the one that you just told, for our listeners, if you're going to read this book, you're going to be held on the edge with every single story. It's great. They do bring comfort. I was kind of trying to figure out, okay, so how am I going to do this interview? Because I want to talk about all 26 stories. And I'm sure that you have a few, that might stick in your mind that you would like to share on our interview. And I have about 2 that I would like to talk about, 2 or 3. I actually have like 5 that are marked, but I think we'll only have time for a couple of yours and a couple of mine. But in the very beginning of the book, you were talking about a patient that you had by the name of Taylor.
Yes.
And there was such a very interesting story with that through you, where it really was intuition. There was something that you did that made no medical sense to prescribe a certain scan, and it was really based on intuition. And I'd really love for you to talk about that because, some of the stories are similar to the patients reporting back, the one that you just shared of what they had seen. But this is about a medical doctor really following his intuition of something kind of almost like having that message of being sent to you and it kind of sticking with you over and over and something that you can't ignore. And this was an amazing story. Before I even got into the book, I was like, oh my gosh. So I was wondering if you could share the story of Taylor.
Sure. Just as an aside ahead of time, I think we all get little hints about things we should be paying attention to or things we should do, and sometimes those little hints are so strong that you can't ignore them, and sometimes they're subtle. And I'm one of the things that I was hoping in this book is to get people to realize that there are little messages that come from above that sometimes can be subtle and sometimes can be very strong. This particular morning, the message that I had was so strong I just simply couldn't ignore it. I had a patient that was traveling. He does a lot of traveling with his job. And he was in, I think, Arkansas or Alabama, one of the southern states. And he called me up and said I was having this abdominal pain, right upper abdominal pain. And I was a little nauseated. And the first thing I think about as a doctor is that's where the gallbladder is. And that's a typical symptom for gallbladder. I said, why don't you get to one of the local hospitals, have them check you out, do some liver enzymes and ultrasound and so forth. And so he did. And I got a call about 2-3 hours later from the emergency room. And they said, Mr. Manning is in the ER here. We've done all the tests, the liver enzymes, the CBC, the ultrasound. Everything was perfectly normal. We gave him some narcotic medication. He's feeling fine now, so we're going to send him out. And I said, fine. When he comes back into town, have him see me, and we'll sort things out. Well, he did. A couple of days later, he showed up, and he was still having some pain. And it sounded just like gallbladder, right upper quadrant, abdominal pain. Sometimes a little worse with eating. No other symptoms. And I said, let's get a fancy gallbladder study and some liver enzymes again and see if we can some amylase and pancreatic enzymes. And so we did all that, and all the tests were perfectly normal. And it's really troubling when a doctor has a patient with a problem that they can't diagnose. And I was thinking about this, and one morning I woke up early in the morning, and I had the idea that he had to get a lung scan. Now, it really didn't make much sense because a lung scan is not what his symptoms were about. He had abdominal pain, but I had this strong feeling that he needed a lung scan. So normally I don't call patients up at the crack of dawn and tell them to get a test. I usually let my nurse do that, and they can do all the scheduling, which sometimes is a hassle. But I called him up early in the morning, and I said, Taylor, I think I've had a feeling that you need to get a lung scan today. And he said, well, that's nice, but I can't. I'm going away to Colorado, and my plane leaves in the afternoon, and I just can't get it in today. And I felt so strongly about it. I said, if I can get it in first thing in the morning, would you go? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and he said, okay, if you can get it in real soon, I'll do it. So I called the X-ray department, and they said, well, we can get it in 2 or 3 days or something like that. And I raised a little stink, and finally they said, okay, just send him over. So I called Taylor, and I said, go over and get the lung scan right now. So about 2 hours later, I got a call from the radiologist, which is a little unusual. Usually you just get the report back and not the call. So he said, that was a good call, Scott. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there was a massive pulmonary embolus sitting on his diaphragm. That's why he had abdominal pain and not chest pain. And had he flown out today, he would have probably died because, there were multiple emboli that he had in his lungs. He probably had some clots in his legs, and he probably would have died on the trip. He said, it's a good call. And I got weak knees myself and had to sit down there and realize what had just happened, that,
Wow.
we'd probably saved a life because of a premonition. And I don't get those very often, but, you get little hints here and there. And I think it's worth at least paying attention to some of those.
Absolutely. Well, and then, with all of the doctors that you've interviewed, and there's more stories in your book that are similar, like that, it just, it makes me wonder, and maybe you can answer this question for yourself, but after you did some of this research and you were collecting all of these stories, do you begin to practice a little bit differently as a doctor?
Well, you pay attention to that little voice in the back of your head, and my partner is particularly aware of that. He's had some experiences where he's had that little naggy voice say, this person needs a stress test or something, and he says to me, I never ignore that voice. And he had one episode where he was clearing a person for surgery. He thought they were perfectly fine, and a couple hours later, he kept that nagging feeling kept coming to him that he needed a stress test. And sure enough, he got a stress test. The patient flunked the stress test badly, ended up with major coronary disease by angiogram, and ended up with a bypass that probably saved his life. So I think I am paying more attention to those little voices, and he is too. And I think many doctors do. And that, I think, is a little additional help from above that gives us a little hint about what's going on. And I think God, or whoever you believe in, does participate in our lives and helps guide us in many cases.
Yeah. And, right off the bat in chapter 1, there's a Dr. Luis. I might butcher his last name. So I'm just going to call him Dr. Luis. Manrique? Okay. So Dr. Manrique. What was interesting about just reading that story is sometimes I think we forget that doctors are humans too, human beings.
Yes.
They have lives just like we do. And this doctor's story was really had nothing to do about working in the practice, but it was something that happened in his own life. And the chapter is entitled, If I Had Been Buckled.
Yes.
And, I think this was just a great way to start the book because it really just hooks you in right away. And I was wondering if we could just talk a little bit about this one as well.
Sure. Luis Manrique is an infectious disease specialist here, and I use him all the time and he's a wonderful doctor, wonderful ordinary doctor. And he came from Peru, so he had to take a test in Peru to get into medical school. And I think there were like 20,000 students taking that test, and they accepted like 100 or something, and he was one of the 100. And so he was lucky enough to get into a medical school there, and eventually immigrated to the United States, where he got a position in infectious disease and is now a great infectious disease doc. He tells about a story when he was in medical school. And he was sleeping in a very small apartment, and one night he thought he was asleep. He wasn't sure if he was asleep or dreaming or he was partially awake, but he refused to open his eyes because he was afraid that if he opened his eyes, the dream might become real. And so evidently the room, he said, filled with light, and he heard this voice somewhere behind him, which didn't make any sense because his bed was up against the wall. So there was nothing behind him except the wall. And the voice said something like, "You're going to be okay." And he thought it was a strange thing to say. He was a little afraid that this voice would be so prominent in his dream. And he was very quiet after that because he wanted to hear the rest of the story, and there was no other story. And then the light seemed to fade in the room, and he never opened his eyes, so he wasn't, again, sure whether this was a dream or it was real. And so the next day, the dream kind of disappeared from his consciousness, and he went through the whole day. It was a Friday, and medical school is pretty tough, and that evening they decided to go out with a couple of their medical students to a local bar, and they were having some drinks. And, the medical students have to study pretty hard, so they were all sleep deprived. So after about 2 hours at the bar and a couple of beers, they decided that, they were all too tired to continue, and they just decided to go home. So they had a designated driver who had actually been drinking, so I don't know why they had a designated driver. And while they were driving on the road, the driver started to get a little crazy and started to go back and forth and swerve. And Luis was a little afraid sitting in the passenger seat. He was unbuckled, and he decided to buckle himself up. And the driver looked at him and said, in an unusually serious tone, "You don't need to buckle." So he let go of the buckle. And about 5 seconds later, they came to a sharp turn, and the car didn't make the turn and started to roll. And the driver's side door opened up. The driver was thrown out of the car and ultimately killed. He was alive for a couple days, but in the hospital ultimately died of his accident. And the car rolled over multiple times, and Luis happened to be pushed over into the driver's seat from the passenger seat because he wasn't buckled. And when the car finally settled down, it was upside down, and he looked over to where the passenger seat was, and the roof of the car was crushed down onto the passenger seat. Had he been buckled and sitting in the passenger seat, he would have been crushed and killed. And so he got out of the people in the back of the car were injured, and he got out of the car quickly and ran to the local fire department where he directed the fire ambulance and so forth to the scene of the accident. And the fire department came and rescued everyone else in the car, and he sat on the curb, and he suddenly realized that he wasn't hurt at all. Nothing. He didn't have a scrape. He was covered with glass from the windshield, but there was no injury whatsoever. And suddenly the dream that he had the night before flooded into his mind, and he said, I realized then that this was the voice of an angel or God or something telling him that he would be safe from that accident. And sure enough, he was. And when he got home, he sat down and got on his knees and with tears in his eyes prayed, thanking the Heavenly Father for saving his life and for warning him about the accident the night before.
Yeah, and in that story, it was interesting how he also noted that, the driver, his friend, that it was so unlike him to say not to buckle in.
Yes.
He just said that wasn't like him, but he listened to him, and decided to go ahead and do that, which was uncanny of his personality.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, and it's stories like that, whether you're a doctor or a scientist. I just can't believe that you can go X amount of years living on planet Earth and not having at least one weird story to tell that would just blow you out of the water, to say, was that synchronicity? Was that something, beyond me? So I like that story because it really didn't have a whole lot to do necessarily with his, medical career, but it was just showing that, doctors probably are experiencing very, interesting stories throughout their life as well as we are.
And April, that's very true, because now that I've written the book, people are coming to me with stories of their own. And I'm amazed at the number of people that have had stories that are miraculous and incredible. And I think my feeling now is that I think everyone has had a story like this at some point in their life, or someone in their family has. And I also think that people, when they really look back at the coincidences in their lives, should realize and are realizing that many of those coincidences where they happen to bump into someone that happened to get them a job or happened to direct them to school where they needed to go or whatever were really not coincidental at all. There was something and some force or whatever. I call it God. Most of the doctors call it the hand of God. But whatever it is, there's something that looks out for us and directs us to do good things and to be successful in our lives.
Yes, I would agree. And this is actually a perfect segue into the next story that I wanted to talk about, which is in Chapter 11, The Dime. And I have heard these types of stories countless times. I think many people have heard before that pennies and dimes can sometimes signify either angels or past loved ones. And I have quite a few stories, just personally here in my own private practice, with some clients. One in particular, I had somebody coming in for a Reiki session, and it was an 8:30 client. And my 5 o'clock client the day before was also a Reiki session. And, we had finished and I had changed the sheets and I put new sheets on and came back to the office the next morning. And at 8:30, my next client comes in. And both of her parents had passed, and her mother recently passed this year. So we talked a little, and we go to bring her onto the Reiki table, and I pull back the blanket, and what's there but a penny and a dime? Wow. And I'm like, so we're both like, oh my God, look at this. And she had found, after her mother had passed away more recently, it was either a penny or a dime with the year of her mom's birth, something of that sort, where it kind of like made that connection, and that was a sign for her. I'm also in the process of moving my private practice to a new building. And I believe in the penny and dimes as being signs because I see them a lot all the time when I'm asking for certain signs. And as I was cleaning out the new office, I go into one of the closets and I'm sweeping, and sure enough, there's a penny right there. And it had my birth date, 1977. So I was like, there's my sign. I'm like, okay, I know I'm supposed to definitely be here. So that was really cool. So when I came across Chapter 11, I just had a smirk the entire time I was reading it. And I have a couple of other penny and dime stories, but those are two that I will share. And I'm not sure if you've had any personal penny or dime stories, but you did share the one of Dr. Stephen Graham.
Yeah, that's a good story. And, it's interesting that, when you write a book, you have editors that edit the book and help you with your grammar and things like that and tell you what, if this is a great story or not a great story. And my editor said, you can't put this story in, it's not a very good story. And I love the story, the dime story. And so she took it out of the book. And I kept on thinking, I've got to put this story in somehow. So I rewrote the story again to make it more interesting. It was still true, but I just rewrote it, some of the words and so forth. And I finally said to her, read this story again, see if you like it. And she said, well, you wrote it a lot better this time. I still don't like the story, but I'll put it in the book. And so I love this story. It's a story Steve Graham, who's an emergency room doc, told me. And he was seeing a patient who had some, I think, with diverticulitis problem in the middle of the night. And he noticed he had a tattoo on his arm that was an unusual tattoo. It was a tattoo of a dime. And the curiosity got the better of him, and he said, tell me about that dime. It's an unusual thing to have a dime tattooed on your arm. And the fellow said, my son collects coins, and his favorite coin is a dime. And it seems like whenever we would go to a special event, like a Cubs game or something, he'd pull up the seat or pull down the seat to sit down, and there'd be a dime there. Or we'd go to a special restaurant, and he'd look under his plate, and there'd be a dime. And he said, my son was killed in an automobile accident. And ever since he was killed, I've been finding dimes. And I find dimes at special events that he would have loved. And he says, I think my son is looking out for me. And I had this tattoo put on my arm to let him know that I know that he's looking out for me and he sees me and he helps me in what I'm doing. And he leaves a dime here and there to let me know. And Dr. Graham, who's a pretty ordinary, conservative kind of a doc, thought this was a nice story, but, and we just couldn't believe it. So he finished his exam, finished his treatment, got him on some antibiotics, and sent him on his way. He went back to the dictation area where patients aren't allowed to go, and was going to dictate his note. And he pulled the chair out and looked down. There was something shiny on the floor, and it was a dime. And Dr. Graham then said to me, I realized then that there's something else, and that maybe maybe he was looking out for him. And it's interesting, that's not the end of the story, because I had my wife, when I first wrote the story, my wife is my number one editor. She'll tell me, and frequently she'll say, Scott, you didn't do a good job on this. Rewrite this story. This is not, it doesn't touch my heart yet. And so she read the dime story and kind of liked it. And I said, that's great. I'll proof it and so forth, correct the spelling. And she walked into the other room to do something, and there on the counter was a dime. And that's not the end of the story either, because ever since that time, I have been finding dimes in crazy places and at crazy times. And if there's something that's going to happen that is really neat sometimes during the day, I'll find a dime. The other day, for example, I was getting dressed in the morning. I was putting on a pair of pants, and there pops out of the pants a dime that fell on the floor. Now, it must have been in my pocket or something, but, it's crazy the way this happens. So I think you're right, April, that I think there's someone else up there, and maybe it's Robbie, who is Steve Graham's, the boy that had died, is still a part of the picture here. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, I'm so happy to hear that you put that story back in.
I did. I love the story. My wife loves the story too, and I had to put it back in, even despite my editor.
Yeah, and I've had so many people, friends, clients, friends of friends, that there are so many, I think, penny and dime stories out there. You could probably create a whole book about the sightings of penny and dimes as being signs from lost loved ones. And I bet our listeners probably have tons of stories as well. That's so cool. Yeah, I love that story. That was really just good and kind of validating, I guess, so many of the penny and dime stories that I've personally have had too. So I'm happy you put that in.
I am too. I think this shows that there are things that we can't explain, that I think when people have left the earth and have died, that I think they still are aware of what we're doing here and still participate in our lives in some interesting and strange ways.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I guess there's one more story that it just again, all of them kind of blow me out of the water. But this one, after I read it, I was kind of thinking, I feel like I've heard this before, and I don't know if I had, or if maybe this was put on a news channel or something of that sort. But it's the story about praying for a miracle in chapter 22, Dr. Thomas Marshall, and working with Barb. Yes.
Barb was a local girl. This is a story that happened a number of years ago, and it's very interesting that I had trouble with this story also. I'll just give you an aside of some of the background of the story. I love the story. I wrote the story. I communicated with Dr. Marshall to get all the details and all the other doctors that were involved with her case, and I couldn't find the patient, Barb Kaminsky. She'd moved away, and I couldn't find her. And I kept looking for her, trying to, I had these search engines and so forth. I paid for some special search engines that would find lost people. And I wrote some letters and made some calls. And I had to turn in the manuscript to the publisher that week. And I was so disappointed that I couldn't find her. I had to take that story out of the book because I couldn't use it without her permission. And about a day before I had to turn the manuscript in, I get a phone call. And who is it? Barb Kaminsky.
Oh, awesome.
How did you know to call me? And she said, well, I got this phone call about 6 months ago from you, and you left a message, and I never called you back. And I just thought about it this week, and I thought I'd just check and see if you're still writing that book. I said, yes, thank you for calling. I need your permission and so forth. And she said, that's no problem at all. You've got my permission. Fax me the permission slip. I'll sign it. And so I was able to turn in the story with the manuscript. So that's kind of an interesting background on the story. But the story goes something like this. Tom Marshall is one of the local doctors here that's a general internist, and he was taking care of Barb Kaminsky. And Barb's history was that of multiple sclerosis. And she had progressive multiple sclerosis, which is a very deforming disease that affects the nerves in the body and the brain. And she was at her end stage, basically. She couldn't walk anymore. She had a tracheostomy tube in her neck. She was unable to get up and around. She had braces on. She had a collapsed lung, so she could hardly breathe very well. Her vision, she was now legally blind. And Tom talked with she and the family, and they decided to put her in hospice. And hospice means, generally, when you admit a person to hospice, you have to certify that they have less than 6 months to live. And Tom told me that he felt that she was going to die any day. Any little infection would take her life. And so it was just a matter of days before she would be dead. And there was a radio show at that time that solicited prayers for individuals that were having really tough times. And Barb happened to be on the show this particular week, and there were lots and lots of prayers that went up for her. And her aunt came to visit her on a Sunday, and she brought a bag of all the letters that had come from the audience of this radio show. And it was really a heavy bag with all the people that had been praying for her. And Barb thought that was really, really nice, but she was pretty sick and wanted to go to sleep. And all of a sudden, she heard a voice in her room. It was a man's voice, and it said something like, "My child, get up and walk." And immediately, she thought it was the voice of God. That's what she told me. And she immediately stood up, and she hadn't been standing for months and probably even years. Took off her braces. She took the oxygen off of her neck where she had the tracheostomy tube. She was able to walk into the next room. She saw her parents, who just started to cry with joy that she could even walk. And her vision came back, and she started to do a ballet. She was a ballet dancer when she was a younger girl, and she started to do a ballet for her parents. Her mother fell down on her knees, looked at her ankles and her legs, and she had her muscles back. And she had atrophied, tremendously before, but her muscles and her legs were back. Barb was so excited about being able to walk that she sat down on the couch and bounced up and down about 20 times because she was so excited that she could sit and rise and sit and rise. And the family, spontaneously went into a prayer, thanking God for deliverance of this, this terrible illness. And the next day, she decided to go to church. It was an evening service. And she had no clothes to wear because her mother had given all her clothes away because she would never wear clothes again because she was so disabled that she was never going to get out of bed. So she had to borrow a dress, so she was late for church. And she walked into the local church here in Wheaton, and the pastor saw her first because he was looking, he was speaking on the pulpit. and suddenly lost his voice. He couldn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. He thought he was seeing a vision because he thought for sure she was going to die. And as Barb walked down the aisle, people started to whisper, "There's Barb Kaminsky. I thought she was dead. I thought she, was disabled. What's going on here?" And this is a moment that must have resonated with everyone in the church, and they must remember this forever. They spontaneously started to sing Amazing Grace. So can you imagine a person walking down the hall that had basically been a dead person, the whole congregation singing Amazing Grace, the pastor standing there with tears in his eyes, unable to even speak. And what a miracle that was. And Barb continued. She saw Dr. Marshall the next day, who took out all of her tubes, got some x-rays, and everything had returned to normal. Her collapsed lung was normal. Everything was normal. And Barb continued then. She vowed that since she had been cured miraculously, that she would dedicate her life to God. And she really has. She married a minister. She lives out east now, and she's a do-gooder. She's doing all kinds of good things, helping people in the world the best she can. And she still remembers, vividly this whole episode. And it's quite a thing. That was truly a miracle.
Yeah, that's a story that just gives you chills and goosebumps all over. And how old was she? Did you mention her age by any chance?
Let's see. She was probably in her 20s at the time.
Wow.
And that was about 30 years ago. And she's now, obviously older and still involved with religion and teaching and helping others.
And still physically well, and the multiple sclerosis never came back.
Totally
wow.
Totally.
So how would science or the medical community, if there wasn't a belief in some sort of miracle, is there any possible way that science could explain what happened?
I think someone could always explain something with some scientific methods. Maybe something changed in her chemistry. There was something that happened, but when a person develops muscles that they didn't have before suddenly within hours, I don't think you can explain that scientifically at all. There's no way to explain that as far as I can tell. That was just a miracle.
Yeah, and that story really, with the bag of prayers, just, really reminds me of the power of prayer or healing circles, or when we set that intention, for a prayer group, or, if you put somebody in a Facebook feed that says, can you please send prayers and positive thoughts to so-and-so for their surgery, that they're finding that there is a collective consciousness, and that really does create an impact. And that's what made me think of that impact of the group of people of all having these positive healing intentions for this one person. And yes. I know that some people would say, oh, well, maybe it was the placebo effect. But the placebo effect is very real as well.
Yes, it is. I think there's power in prayer. There's lots of doctors that have told me stories of prayer that have been absolutely miraculous. And I think there's a great power in prayer. There's a great power in a collective prayer, too, multiple people praying for an individual. I think that is even more powerful.
Yes, I would agree. So, and for our listeners, we've only touched on a few stories. Every single story in this book is amazing, and it's wonderful. And like I said, Dr. Scott, I would love to talk about probably 20 more if we could. But before we wrap up, is there anything in particular, any one story that you really feel always needs to be shared during a podcast interview that you would like our listeners to hear?
Oh, I've got lots of favorite stories, and I listened to, I interviewed 200 doctors, and I listened to many, many stories. And the only stories I included in the book were stories that either gave me goosebumps or made me cry, and not out of sadness, but out of emotion. And I still get goosebumps and tear up, even when I read my own stories. It's crazy. One of my favorites, though, is the Grandma Hanlon story. Do you want me to tell that one?
Yes, please.
Grandma Hanlon was a midwife that delivered babies. She was an Irish midwife, and this was a fair number of years ago, and she worked in the Irish community in south side of Chicago. And she was a spiritual leader of the family. She'd deliver babies and sometimes do it for nothing. And she'd stay with the mother for a number of weeks to help out in the home. And if the people couldn't pay, she said that was fine. She just did this out of kindness. And Grandma Hanlon Grandma Hanlon was the grandmother of Joan Heitzler, who's Dr. Heitzler's wife. And so Grandma Hanlon ultimately became older, could not deliver babies anymore, and lived with Joan Heitzler's mother. And so Joan Heitzler, her mother, and her grandma lived together. And Joan would always say that if I could make it to Grandma Hanlon's lap, if I got in trouble with my mom and I could get to Grandma Hanlon's lap, I'd be safe. And so that was an interesting thing. And they loved each other. They had an incredible, loving bond together. And Joan Heitzler was delivering her fifth child. And she started to experience a great deal of pain. The delivery was done, but they were doing some procedures after the delivery, and she was in a fair amount of pain. At the time, they decided to give her some trilene, which is an anesthetic that goes over the face. It's a mask, and that puts a person into a deep sleep, and they can do the procedures without any pain, obviously. And so they were about ready to put the trilene mask over Joan's face when all of a sudden Grandma Hanlon steps into the room, the delivery room. She stands at the foot of the bed, and she's dressed in her little polka dot dress that she always had, and a sweater vest, and her hair was put up in the bun, and she had old Grandma Hanlon shoes on. And she shook her head. "No, don't do that, Joan." And so Joan pushed the trilene away, and she decided to kind of tough it out and not take the anesthetic and not be unconscious. Well, no one realized that Joan had eaten a large meal about just before she went into labor. And about a minute after she pushed the trilene mask away, she vomited the entire meal. Had she had the mask on and been unconscious, she would have probably aspirated. She may have died or had a serious complication from an aspiration pneumonia. And so Grandma Hanlon slipped out of the room, her mission accomplished. Joan had made it to her lap one last time, overcoming time and all eternity, because Grandma Hanlon had died 22 years before.
I love that story.
It's a good story. I love that story too.
Yes. And how would you say, after writing this book and all of the exposure that you've gotten, I know that you've been, doing a lot of interviews and just getting feedback from people and probably hearing from the other doctors and the feedback that they're getting. How has it changed your life? You can't help but have a stronger faith when you write a book like this and get so much feedback from doctors and from people. And what's happening now is people are telling me their own stories. They read this book and they say, "I've got a story of my own I want to tell you." And, that's a very faith-strengthening thing that's gone on in my life. I'm more optimistic about the future. I think I have hope, much more hope than I did before. And, there are lots of bad things that happen in the world. People die, people get sick, there's financial issues that people have. And these stories have given me hope that there's something else that loves us. There's a God out there that looks out for us, that guides us. And if we listen to the little things, the little promptings here and there, and pay attention to the coincidences, we'll be a lot more peaceful and hopeful. And I think that's what's happened to other people that have read the book. I think we were able to give them some hope that there's something else and that someone loves them unconditionally. And that's my great joy. When I hear a person say to me, "I read your book and I feel so much better about my life now," that is what it's all about. Yeah. And have you continued to practice medicine, or has this book taken you away from your practice, or are you doing both?
I'm still practicing. I tell my patients when I get it perfect, I'll quit, but I'm still practicing, and it hasn't taken me away. And I think I'm looking to write another book at some point in my abundant leisure time, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. But I'm still practicing full time, and I love my practice.
Well, thank you so much. This was just a great book to come across my lap and to read. It brought me a lot of just hope and peace, and it was really fun to, read these stories. I think anybody that picks this book up is going to love it. Could you let our listeners know where they can find it if they would like to purchase it?
Sure. Physicians Untold Stories. The main place is probably Amazon. It's available through a Kindle and also a soft cover.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for being a guest on the Path 11 podcast. I really enjoyed this interview.
Thanks, April. It's fun to be here.
If you'd like more information about our films or to purchase our DVDs, you can head on over to our website at thepastseries.com. They're also available to purchase on amazon.com.
Our films are also streaming online at vimeo.com, gaiamtv.com, and iTunes.
If you have a show suggestion or would like us to interview someone specifically, please feel free to shoot us an email at info@thepastseries.com or send us a tweet at thepastseries.
Please rate and review us in iTunes and subscribe.
We hope you enjoyed the show.